Greeting, greeting, students. Welcome back to class. Uh, I messaged you all earlier today. Uh, uh, didn't have the live lecture this evening. I'm recording this lecture and I'll be posting it on Canvas. And so I'll also switch up the syllabus and update that and post it as well. Have a couple of things I want you to read this week, and one being a chapter from uh, the book that I've been talking to you about, and we've had a little bit of an assignment, the Atlantic article, Matthew McGaw, and his really interesting book um, that has taken an interesting look at uh, an LAPD case that went cold for many years until forensic science sort of came in and cracked the case. And so that book I wasn't able to give you this semester, but he's actually sent us one of the chapters that is pretty relevant and relevant to specifically the 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 instance in that case where the LAPD DNA analyst ran into some sort of ethical sort of conundrum when that individual was trying to get the results, um, out. And so I'll assign that chapter for us to read this week. And so next Tuesday we will discuss with the author himself in our live Zoom session. So be on the lookout for the Canvas assignments. And um, let me just see if I can pull up, make sure. I'm going to pull up Canvas here because I don't think I have put anything up yet. And let me just, yeah, nothing yet. Okay. So for week 5, that's where that chapter will be. And so be on the lookout for that. And I might have another assignment as well. So again, this is all related to Matthew McGaw and his book, The Lazarus Files. And, you should already be familiar with it. But I think it's really cool that he sent us the chapter because I wasn't really able to, assign the whole book for you this semester. So I think that'll be really interesting. It highlights a case, and it'll be nice to hear from someone, the author them himself. Was pretty neat. Okay, so I'll redo the syllabus for our class just to notate the change in the scheduling, and I'll post that. Then yeah, I have a couple assignments I need to go over for that you've submitted so far this semester, and I'll be working on those this weekend. So be on the lookout for some of my commentary on that. I hope you're all doing well. This lecture today, I have basically a few slides that I want to get through. So let's get to those now. And again, we're talking about the NAS report and some of the subsequent things that have occurred since the NAS report. And we'll highlight one of the cases that were one of the sort of big failures of forensic science that sort of led to the creation of the NAS report to begin with. So let me share the screen here, and we will pull up the PowerPoints. So here's our PowerPoint presentation for today, and let's get into it. So basically, I'll start off with a nice little video. This is Vox. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's a pretty cool website. And so this is just kind of an interesting presentation of the Brandon Mayfield case, which is a pretty famous case now because pretty much everyone that touched these fingerprints all sort of agreed that they belonged to somebody when in fact they did not at all. And There's a lot to really talk about here, like confirmation bias, and I'll try to have a lecture based just on that sort of confirmation bias and some of those biases in the forensic sciences that are a major problem, especially for this type of forensic science application, sort of pattern recognition. So I'll just go ahead and play this, and then I have another video at the end as well. And so I might turn off my camera feed while we're watching this, but then I'll just kind of pop back in right when it's done. Okay. Let's see if I can get this to play here. Here we go.
A heinous crime has been committed at Vox. Somebody keeps drinking the single source Ethiopian Yirgacheffe coffee that I bring to the office for myself. I rounded up 5 suspects from around the office and fingerprinted them to see if I could find a match from a print I found on my mug. Is fingerprint analysis reliable enough to pin somebody to this unspeakable crime? And more importantly, how do you actually do it?
Oops, let me do that again. I guess I can't turn the camera off, so.
A heinous course Ethiopian Yirgacheffe coffee that I bring to the office for myself.
Still playing with the capabilities of Zoom.
I rounded up 5 suspects from around the office and fingerprinted them to see if I could find a match from a print I found on my mug. Is fingerprint analysis reliable enough to pin somebody to this unspeakable crime? And more importantly, how do you actually do this? To help me figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do, I brought in an expert.
My name is Peter Valentin. I'm an expert in crime scene reconstruction and forensic science. A fingerprint is probably the most important piece of information when we don't have a known connection between the victim and the offender. We have to find something that people leave at scenes relatively easy, and something that is unique enough that finding it and identifying what it is will lead us back to the person.
In order to find a fingerprint, investigators will either use a physical component like a powder, so not cocoa powder? Cool. Or a series of chemicals that make a print visible on a surface. Our fingerprints have ridges and furrows that align to create unique recognizable patterns.
There is what's called a loop right here. You have ridges that are coming into the pattern and then coming back out. Here's another loop right here. There's arches and there's whorls. And those 3 categories alone comprise at least 95% of the fingerprints that are in the database.
Everyone's fingerprints have unique features that differentiate them from everyone else's. For instance, this ridge splits into 2 here, and this ridge has a break in it. These patterns remain the same throughout a person's lifetime, which makes them a powerful identification tool. My fingerprint is pretty easy to spot. The pattern looks like a 1998 Chrysler Sebring. Investigators rely on the characteristics of a print to find a match, using a method called ACE-V. First, they analyze the print and the surface it's on to see if it's viable for examination. This one's great. This one, not so much. Then they take the suitable print and compare it against known fingerprints, looking for points of similarity and differences. For example, both these patterns are whorls, and bifurcate right here. Investigators look at these traits and try to gauge if there's enough points of comparison to declare it a match. Finally, a qualified peer reviews their conclusion to verify the match. After using high-tech software to analyze the prints from my mug, I'm kidding, this is just some stock footage I downloaded, I think I finally found a match. But okay, even when it's done by professionals, how reliable is fingerprint analysis?
It's a useful tool that obviously has value, but I think it's problematic to overstate its value, especially in a criminal justice context.
One accuracy study found that examiners made false positive identifications in 0.1% of cases, which means identifying a print as a match when it's not. That doesn't sound too bad, unless you happen to be one of those false positives. Brandon Mayfield, a lawyer from Oregon, was one of those unlucky few. He was falsely accused of the 2004 Madrid train bombing because the FBI made a false positive match with a partial print found at the scene. Mayfield seemed like a good suspect to investigators because he had recently converted to Islam and was the lawyer for a man who attempted to join the Taliban, which in the wake of 9/11 were all red flags for the FBI.
There was a bias that existed because once they tentatively identified the unknown fingerprints belonging to this individual, who he was and what his background was, made the identification seem stronger than it actually was.
He didn't have a valid passport. So it's a little implausible on the face of it that he was handling a bag of detonators in Spain. Fingerprinting was so powerful that they just sort of, it trumped everything else.
Mayfield was even given his own analyst to examine the prints, and even they agreed that it was a match.
That's an interesting thing about bias because, you know, everybody's assumption is that the experts are biased toward the side that they're working for. Here was a guy who was working for Mayfield, and yet he corroborated the evidence against him, which turned out to be incorrect.
The FBI released a 330-page report about where their analysts went wrong, and it's pretty much a case study in a lot of the potential downfalls of fingerprinting. They cited things such as ignoring differences between the prints, lack of independent verification, the pressure of working on a high-profile terrorism investigation, and letting bias about the suspect affect their analysis. Their report summed it up by saying, in any human endeavor, there is a potential for error.
You know, I would sort of suggest learning from history and realizing that none of these things are going to be error-free. So there's going to be mistakes and errors and screw-ups, but also evidence is inherently probabilistic.
So even though it's not a perfect tool, until a more reliable technology emerges, law enforcement will continue to utilize fingerprint analysis. And I won't ever be fully certain of who stole my coffee until I catch them on this new surveillance camera that I installed.
All right. So I'm assuming you probably already know about the Brandon Mayfield case from some of your other courses. And so it's fascinating. It's really just pretty remarkable how the system sort of failed in that case, sort of pinning someone to a place, a time, an action that completely did not occur based on a partial fingerprint. And so big problem with the Brandon Mayfield case. And so really put a spotlight on what is it exactly we're doing here with fingerprint analysis. Now, I'm pretty uncomfortable with the idea of fingerprint analysis to begin with. I mean, I think that just like this presentation kind of says, is that basically it's a human endeavor trying to match these prints to one another, and with that comes human error. And so now I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And basically fingerprints and DNA are like two of the main sort of tools investigators have at solving cases. And so really the biggest problem, aside from the introduction of bias into the fingerprint analysis as an example, it is just that we have a comparison analysis, and so it's going to continue to be used. Really what we need to do with this is just talk about it better in court. And I think that's where a lot of the terminology used in court, 100% match, you can't say stuff like that, right? Because you don't know if it's 100% match, or, do you really know that all fingerprints are unique? And, they've launched studies since then to really, put statistics and values to the kind of terms and claims that one would make about the friction ridge analysis. And so pretty interesting. And so this is I bring up this case just because it was this and a couple other cases that sort of put the spotlight on the forensic sciences and prompted let's see if I can get to the next slide here. The NAS report. Okay, so strengthening forensic science in the United States, a path forward. So this is the big NAS report that everyone sort of talks about. This comes on around 2009. Yeah, they got a bunch of sort of, some scientists, some non-scientists, kind of all put their heads together, excuse me, and try to tackle, what are the things that are issues currently at that time in the forensic sciences, and how are ways to do better, and what are actions that can be taken to strengthen the forensic sciences moving forward, from some of the blunders like the Mayfield case, right? So some of the kind of like blockbuster things that this report describes are things like this excerpt. With the exception of, nuclear DNA analysis, no forensic method has been rigorously shown to be able to consistently and with a high degree of certainty demonstrate a connection between evidence and a specific individual or source. So that's pretty compelling. And basically, they're saying that you found trace evidence, particles of dust, hair, fingerprints. There's not been rigorous, consistent, high degree of certainty demonstrations that you can connect those types of evidence on a person to place, or pin that to a specific individual or source. So this is a big problem because sometimes trace evidence is a major factor in a case, and sadly, I think honestly, due to the NAS report, there's been sort of like a decline in the number of people working in trace units, and some labs have gotten rid of trace, altogether, which I don't think that's a good thing for forensic science, because those fields in the trace analysis, it can be very important. And really what this all comes down to is, how the data is being interpreted and how it's being presented. Because and you guys know about, the differences between evidence, and whether or not it can be individualized or, sort of like a class characteristic, and just, being careful how you talk about the evidence in the courtroom. So that's kind of a big deal coming out of the NAS report. They also brought up things like the potential for conflicts of interest between the needs of the law enforcement and the broader needs of forensic science, right? So that goes to this idea that we talked about last time in last week's, and so the reason why some people like last week's assignment are pushing for a separation between policing and the forensic science, and forensic scientists, are because of the potential for conflicts of interest there. and I haven't read all of your responses yet to last week's assignment, but it'll be interesting to see what you all thought. I mean, to me, I guess, there does seem to be a perception, and this is based on my experience working, the majority of the time working for like the public defender's office, so working for the defense, that the criminalists that come in, that are the state's expert, right, which would be all of you, that you get into your criminalist positions in the law enforcement agency crime labs, that you're just gunning for the prosecution, and you're gonna kind of say anything you can to make sure the prosecution can win the case. Now, I also know a lot of the criminalists, like in LAPD and the LA County Sheriff, and they're obviously not like that. I mean, many of them are a product of our graduate program, and so they have a good head on their shoulders, and they know what they can and cannot say in the courtroom. So I don't think that that's a major issue regionally, but perhaps in some parts of the country that could be a problem. And so the idea of separating these entities does seem to make some sense. Now, something I don't think I mentioned last time is that there has been some sort of pushback in Texas, and that has to do with dispatching. And so, when there is a crime that occurs, law enforcement's going to be alerted first of all. And so what sort of happened in sort of Texas is like, well, there's a crime scene, law enforcement, gets notified, but they're going to want the forensic scientists to be there at the scene collecting evidence before it gets deteriorated or moved or any other sort of things that could happen to evidence at a crime scene. So now they have to like call the forensic science unit and then have them come. And so there can be some lag there, and the time there in that lag can be a factor, especially if some of the evidence is fleeting, right? So if it's all in the same wheelhouse, so law enforcement knows about it, law enforcement forensic scientists know about it, everyone's going, everyone sort of knows about it. That's a quicker response, a better response potentially, right? So that would be like a pros and cons of that separation. But and so in sum, the committee concluded that advancing science in the forensic science enterprise is not likely to be achieved within the confines of the DOJ. So basically saying that it's probably a good thing to reach out to basic scientists, academics, researchers at universities, and see how they can assist forensic science with, strong basic science as well. And that, the Department of Justice alone isn't going to solve the issues that forensic science, currently was having at the time. All right. So interesting stuff coming out of the NAS report. So the ramifications of that report are things like here in State v. Ward in 2010, where in that case, you see excerpts like this. Recently, the field of forensic science has come under scrutiny on a nationwide basis when articulating the right of a criminal defendant under the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution to confront forensic analysis as witnesses at trials. The Supreme Court of the United States in Melendez-Diaz v. Massachusetts was quick to recognize the significance of a landmark report issued in the 2009 by the National Academy of Sciences, so the NAS report. So bringing that into the courtroom, certainly the defense is going to bring that in and question right away, if all you have on my defendant is bite mark analysis, well, let's just pick it apart, right? In this case, in particular, in this case specifically, it was kind of a bad one. So in this case, the forensic analyst identified a drug using a Rolodex, which turn back the clock like 20, 30 years, labs were using just Rolodex, pictures of the drugs. And honestly, you get good enough at it, you can kind of look at a drug, yeah, this is cocaine, this is meth, these are the crystals, and this is meth right here, you can tell what it looks like based on images, bust out the Rolodex with other images of unfortunately, that's not really a chemical analysis. And so in this case, that, just, looking at pictures of something to confirm what drug you have, not going to cut it, right? So that was a big deal here in this case, and they incite the NAS report. So I'll have a video here at the end that goes on. There's been several things that have happened since NAS report. You may have heard of the OSACs, all these organizational committees, things slowly happening on the national level, like a national code of ethics for forensic science that that you guys have learned, hasn't really happened yet, but people are working on it, and various other things as well. So so this video at the end, I'm going to have us all watch that as well, because it really kind of, really interesting summary of the timeline of things that have occurred post NAS report. One of them being the PCAST report. So this is a report to the president, and that was the President Obama at the time. So the Forensic Science and Criminal Courts Ensuring Scientific Validity and Feature Comparison Methods. So this is an executive report, the PCAST report. They did a study there. They compiled or reviewed a set of more than 2,000 papers from various sources. They obtained input from forensic scientists, practitioners, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, academic researchers, criminal justice reform advocates, and representatives of federal agencies. They made recommendations directed at the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, White House Office of Science and Technology and Policy, FBI, Attorney General, etc. So I have it linked. I have you linked out to the PCAST report. I'm going to put into, I think, the Canvas a link to the NAS report and a link to the PCAST report. Now, here's the thing: they're long reports, but I do want you to open the reports and I want you to skim through and see what you see inside those reports. And if you haven't already done that, it'll be a great a great exercise. If you've done this already, then please just check them out again. I might have an assignment based on what are the things that you see, what are the sort of main issues that the NAS report and PCAST reports are sort of trying to tackle. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily require you read the entire document of each, but you can go into like the table of contents and maybe skim through the document and look at the sort of some of the main things that are going on in those documents. Okay, and PCAST, there's an addendum as well, but we won't worry about that one for now. So findings regarding scientific validity that they have done here, basically they're saying that only single sourced samples of DNA and fingerprints are scientifically validated. And again, we've had some of our graduates get into crime labs, and they come back to the classes and tell us, the things that solve crimes, fingerprints and DNA every time. I mean, trace evidence is nice. It can be useful. Some of the other areas of forensic science are nice. They can be useful. But at the end of the day, fingerprints and DNA are some of the heavy hitters. Firearms had some issues with their validity studies. And then bite mark, shoe prints, hair comparisons, interpretation of mixtures of DNA are not validated. And some they found were even invalid altogether. And so, you may or may not know, I mean, I'm assuming you do at this point, that, mixtures of DNA analysis in mixtures is pretty problematic as it currently stands using standard STR analysis. There's usefulness of using newer techniques for DNA analysis, but the way it's currently done, when there's more than one, 2 or 3 persons' blood or biological sample in a mixture, that it becomes very difficult at that point to distinguish one another from those. And so people do it, and some people are good at that. However, it is very problematic, and so that's been a big issue with DNA analysis. Okay, PCAST recommendation 7. Where there is no meaningful information about the accuracy of a forensic science feature comparison method, the U.S. DOJ attorneys and examiners should not offer testimony based on this method. So that was a big deal too, because they're saying if there's not a bunch of citations there documenting the accuracy of some sort of comparison analysis, then we have no business talking about it in court. And that's a big deal, and have received a lot of pushback. In testimony, examiners should always state clearly that errors can and do occur due to similarities in features and due to human mistakes in the lab. Now, that's absolutely 100% true, but you're a prosecutor. You don't really want to have to come in and say that, right? Because at the end of the day, you're talking to a jury and you're trying to convince a jury. But what if I turn to the jury and say, guess what, everyone? Errors happen, and human mistakes in the lab can occur. Okay. And so why wouldn't a defense attorney right away just go, well, that's what happened in this case. Absolutely, it was an error, human errors. So you can see how that's a little bit problematic. And in fact, the NDAA response was this, and that's the NDAA is the National District Attorney Association's response to PCAST reports. The PCAST position regarding the use of forensic science is scientifically irresponsible. Adopting any of their recommendations would have a devastating effect on the ability of law enforcement, prosecutors, and the defense bar to fully investigate their cases, exclude innocent suspects, implicate the guilty, and achieve true justice at trial. So a lot of people hating on the PCAST report. Notwithstanding the lack of qualifications, PCAST has taken upon itself to usurp the constitutional role of the courts and decades of legal precedent and assert itself as the final arbitrator of the reliability and admissibility of the information generated through these forensic science disciplines. So really just mad that PCAST report came out, throwing a monkey wrench into many, many years of the usage of some of these forensic science tools in the courtroom. I don't know. What do you think about that? So obviously this is a recorded lecture. I can't ask you guys this question, but thinking about things like bite mark analysis, like absolutely, someone probably shouldn't be getting sent to jail if some of the only evidence against them is like a bite mark. There's just no real good evidence that says that those types of comparisons are valid, right? There's more information about fingerprints, and you just have to be careful, like how you exclude and include and make those judgments. And so that's why we've seen fingerprints continue to be used. But there was a lot of pushback, especially with the especially with these guys, right? The NDAA. So. All right, the DOJ response. So at the time, the Attorney General was Loretta Lynch. I don't know if you remember that, under the Obama administration. Loretta Lynch said in a statement to the Wall Street Journal, while we appreciate their contribution to the field of scientific inquiry, the department will not be adopting the recommendations related to the admissibility of forensic science evidence. So basically this report got squashed. We're not listening. Because you're really going to throw a monkey wrench into all the prosecutions and that we're trying to do here to seek justice. So kind of interesting. I'm not sure if any of you knew about that. So so what's happened since that 2009 report? This is a video that I might just, sit here and watch it again with you guys because it is pretty interesting. And so this gentleman, has a very nice presentation at this forensic science conference just a couple of years ago now. But talking about what has happened since 2009. Okay, let's play it.
It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker who will guide us through what has happened since the 2009 National Academies report. We are very fortunate to have with us this morning Dr. John Butler. He's an internationally renowned expert in forensic DNA analysis. He's pioneered methods used today worldwide for DNA testing in criminal cases, paternity cases, and ancestry procedures. He's written 5 textbooks since 2001. He's given hundreds of lectures in the US and worldwide. He's served on multiple committees and also has received many, many awards and served as the vice chair of the National Commission on Forensic Science. Join me in welcoming Dr. Butler.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today and to kind of give you a brief history of where we've come in the last decade. That's my challenge for today. And the points I'll make are mine and not those of NIST. And if I mention any products, I'm not endorsing them. So as we look, kind of why should we look at a historical review? If you want to understand yesterday, you have to search, or if you want to understand where we are today, we need to search where we came from. Search yesterday is what Pearl Buck said. And also we've probably familiar with this quote, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so if we can learn from where we come from, perhaps we can go forward even further in the future. So Tom showed the picture. I wanted to go through briefly the 13 recommendations that were part of this report. And this is a kind of a succinct grouping that Sue Ballou put together earlier this year in a report that she published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. But really the most important one up front is the first one, which is to establish a National Institute of Forensic Science, is what would call for Congress to be able to do that. That hasn't happened, of course. But from there, these other things were encouraged, that we have standard terminology for reports and testifying, that there be address issues of validity and accuracy and reliability and so on, that there be a separation of labs from law enforcement agencies. We do research on human bias and so on, codes of ethics, and developing programs to help attract students. And so there's a lot that's gone on. And in the time I have, I'm not going to be able to go through all of these in detail, but I will point out that there's a Google search found from Google Scholar, there's been almost 1,000 citations to this report. So certainly people are referring back to the report. And then we have from a recent legal review, I think there's been about 218 or so references in the legal literature to forensic, just to this report. So certainly it's well aware of. There's been several summaries, kind of what have happened previously. There was a White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, Research Strategy Working Group that put together a 5-year summary of where we were kind of at that point. And then I've written a couple articles, kind of the things that have happened with building the National Commission and OSAC, and some of those activities have been published, and those are available in the open access literature. And so when this PDF becomes available, there's links on these to be able to go to those articles if you want. So where to begin kind of looking at a decade of development? We could consider possibly where, congressional hearings have been held, what kind of books have been published, what kind of reports have been issued, what kind of media coverage has there been, what kind of training courses have been offered, has there been important research published, what kind of meetings have been held, and what kind of major activities have happened. We've had the Subcommittee on Forensic Science, the National Commission on Forensic Science, the Organization of Scientific Area Committees. So there's a lot that could be covered here. And so as I thought about how to try to touch on this, I'll show you a timeline of these pieces, but there have been 6 congressional hearings on forensic science since 2009. I list them here, 4 from the Senate and 2 from the House. And I list all the various presenters. This one here, the second one, kind of the science and standards of forensic science, is what led to really a lot of the discussions that led to the commission and to OSAC being formed, with the director of NIST, Patrick Gallagher, presenting there. And there was one very recently, about 2 months ago, that was held, kind of where are we in terms of raising the bar and looking at future needs in forensic science. And Sue Ballou from NIST spoke, as well as Lynn Garcia from the Texas Forensic Science Commission, Vicki Bahena from Oklahoma Innocence Project, Karen Kafadar from the University of Virginia and the American Statistical Association, and Matt Gammy from the CFSO and ASCLD and the Idaho State Police. So there have been a number of hearings that have happened. And so we can learn certainly from looking at those things what have been said. There's been lots of books published. This is just a few that I captured since 2009 that have been written on the topic. So you can see that there's a lot that certainly has been published. And there's really a growing literature. This is just literature on fingerprint analysis, and you'll hear more from Joanne Biscaglia later this morning about the FBI white box and black box studies that they've done. And these are just some of the studies and some other ones that people have done to try to improve our knowledge of what's there. So I thought I'd try to put together a quick timeline and give you just a drive through of where we've come in the last decade. So since the report came out in February of 2009, there was Arizona State University at our law school had a big conference that was held kind of discussing that, and that led to a number of other discussions. There was the congressional hearing I mentioned in the fall of that year, and then the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy introduced a subcommittee on forensic science that operated for several years. And both the co-chairs for that are here. Ken Melson and Mark Stoller were the co-chairs for that effort. There was the National Science Foundation had a cognitive bias workshop, and I think Rebecca Farrell will cover that and some other topics more. We've already heard from Jennifer Mnookin, published a number of articles on this topic, but this is one on research culture that needs to be encouraged, that she mentioned in the UCLA Law Review in 2011. And since that time, we've had a lot of research that's happened. We'll hear about that from from the FBI, for example, and Joanne Biscali will talk about some of the work that they've done there. We'll hear from NIJ in the next session as well about things that they've been funding, things we will hear from NIST, the work that's gone on there, and also from NSF. There's human factors. We'll hear more about that this afternoon, and efforts that have gone on to look at fingerprints and the human factors there. There's been introduction of APHIS interoperability that's come out. The NIJ has a Forensic Technology Center of Excellence. I think we'll probably hear more about that. There's a Dear Colleague letter that came out in 2013 from the National Science Foundation as well. And there was an effort for several years to look at research strategy, and kind of a working group was formed by OSTP and that operated through the end of 2013 and beginning of 2014 before the National Commission started. And that's where the progress report that I mentioned earlier, kind of the 5-year progress report was published. And if you haven't seen that before, that's a good place to kind of look back at where we were after 5 years. NIST has had a series of presentations about every 2 years on research updates, and we'll hear more from Robert Thompson about work in the bullets, efforts in the ballistics, measurements, firearms identification. There's been, Interpol has had a number of reviews every 3 years. Interpol has a review of what's happening in the literature, and thousands of articles are reviewed every 3 years as part of that. The last one just happened about a month ago, and so there'll be reports coming out from that. The NSF came up with industry, university cooperative research centers, and several of those are operational now in forensic science. So we'll see where that kind of takes us as we go forward. We have CSAFE, and we'll hear a little bit more about that today, is a center of excellence that NIST has funded. The Innocence Project has pointed out some of the challenges that exist in forensic science. Brandon Garrett's book talked about in 2011, Convicting the Innocent. The FBI had a hair review that was operated for several years with input from the Innocence Project. We've had more, I mentioned there's several in 2012 and 2013 congressional hearings that happened, looking at kind of where the field is. There was a memorandum of understanding between DOJ and NIST that was signed in February 2013, and that led to the formation of the National Commission on Forensic Science and to the Organization of Scientific Area Committees for forensic science that's still operational, and that's led to the formation of the AFS Standards Board to write documentary standards coming out of OSAC, and also strengthening of ASTM International, again, making standards that can help with documenting and improving the practice of forensic science. We've had strengthening, I think, within the accreditation efforts, and certainly there's been a new version of the ISO 17025 that came out in 2017. Tom Albright talked about the Eyewitness National Academy of Sciences study that came out in 2014. The Texas Forensic Science Commission this is a bite mark report that they came out with a couple years ago. Forensic science has made the front cover of Science. And this is the bullets from NIST, some research studies that have gone on that made the front cover. We've had articles, of course, in National Geographic and other media sources. And in 2016, the PCAST report was published in September of 2016 with an addendum in January of 2017. There was a Harvard Law review, Harvard Law school panel that was held in October 2017, I think was quite interesting, looking kind of the legal intersections with some of these points. And there's a committee, I think we'll probably hear more about this later today, on the Federal Rules of Evidence 702 and the efforts that are going on looking at that. There was a call for more science and forensic science published in PNAS last year, and calls for forensic reform in law review articles and so on. There's been efforts most recently since the commission came out with the desire to have the technical merit reviews. There's been efforts to look at this, and we'll hear, I think, this afternoon from the National Institute of Forensic Science in Australia, their efforts with forensic fundamentals and looking at some of the basics, knowledge of what we do know in the field. We've heard about AAAS has come out with 2 studies on fire investigation on latent fingerprints that came out 2 years ago, and looking again at where do these fields stand. And NIST has begun efforts now with scientific foundation reviews with congressional funding, first with DNA mixture interpretation, looking at bite mark evidence, and now starting one in firearms examination. So again, there's been further congressional hearings in 2017 and 2019, kind of seeing where we are and where need to go. And of course, more funding and resources are important to be able to move some of these things forward. The Department of Justice has issued 14, I think, so far of their uniform language and test for testimony and reporting. And there's a new Flint twig that's just started that's trying to develop strategic approaches to introducing new technology and addressing some of the needs in the communities. And I think we'll hear more about that from NIJ today. And back in 2013, there was a conference that NIST helped organize on forensic governance. And I'll mention that as well in the next slide. But I think what we're going to hear from the Virginia and from the Houston lab is how the rubber hits the road with really trying to implement new things. We have at NIST, we've done 2 conferences on error management in 2015 and 2017, looking at some of the challenges with how reporting errors and moving forward with this. We've also had conferences on looking at the weight of evidence, looking at how do we implement research and into the field and going from innovation to implementation. And then we most recently last month had a conference on evidence management. How do we make sure that evidence is properly stored and conveyed to people? We have, back in 2013, NIST and NIJ did a kind of biological evidence preservation and how that things can be preserved there. We had a FBI and NIST organized a joint effort, a DNA Technical Leaders Summit to look at some of the challenges with DNA mixture interpretation. The DC lab was closed in 2015 because of mixture interpretation. It was one of the reasons we're focusing efforts on the scientific foundation reviews in this area. And then I think most recently, for the DNA folks, investigative genetic genealogy has become a new opportunity to kind of explore new challenges, because now we have to deal with how do we face the issues of privacy and the need for security, and coping with that and connecting that with the general public. So there's a lot that's been happening in the last decade. I would also refer you to the National Commission, when it concluded 2 years ago, published a 58-page report reflecting back and looking forward towards the future. And it has a lot of things that still need to be worked on that were addressed at that time. So that's my kind of quick overview of the last 10 years. So just in the last couple minutes I have, just mention this meeting was held at the DC Crime Lab in 2013. One of the things that came out of it was a white paper that is still available on kind of how to organize and govern forensic labs from the perspective of the from the Netherlands Forensic Institute. And I commend that as something worth looking at. The National Commission had 13 meetings that allowed the opportunity to have great discussions and to coordinate government efforts, to learn from previous efforts, and to introduce new efforts. We had 140 different presenters that spoke in the 13 meetings we had there. And I think that you can go back and look at those. NIST still maintains those videos if anybody wants to go back and see some of the discussions that were held on this topic. Of course, it closed 2 years ago with the charter expiration. But again, I refer you to the report, the 58-page kind of summary of what happened and summarizing that. Jules Epstein, one of the commissioners, wrote an article last year in a law review. It just kind of was the commission impactful or ineffectual with a question mark? And I think that still remains to be seen as we go forward with, did we learn from these things from the history there? NIST continues to support forensic activities, and primarily these 4 buckets, and Robert Raventowski will go over these in more detail in terms of conducting research, partnering with the community, convening meetings, and then exploring the scientific foundations. But I want to step back for a moment and talk about history and look at Wilmer Sauter, who was the first forensic scientist at NIST. In 1932, he published these 4 ideals for firearms identification. That we should have minimum standards of equipment. We have standards for records of evidence. We have standards for the qualification of experts. We have methods for constantly following up with experts that are testifying in court. And I would say that 87 years later, we're still addressing these same challenges. And so that's part of why it's valuable to look back at history and see what have we learned from these things. So OSAC is certainly making efforts to prepare and promulgate documentary standards. Efforts are being made here, but there's still a lot to be done in terms of standardizing requirements for equipment and so on. In terms of standards on reports and case record contents, ISO 17025 is labs are accredited to that, provides much of that, but there can be more that can be done there. PCAST may request for empirical data that we need to support the conclusions, and I think there's a growing effort to address that. And then finally, DOJ is doing FBI examiner testimony evaluation and to ensure compliance to their alters, and I think that's a good start on things. But I would say, are we learning from history, or are we repeating it? And sometimes, as we look back at where we come from, it's valuable to appreciate that. A psychologist who is the director of research at the U.S. Civil Service Commission in 1936 spoke to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and he said the following: that we need to use as a basis for evidence instruments whose validity is not known will merely discredit the investigation work. And he pleads for greater knowledge of validity of scientific methods and the development of more valid measures. And finally, he proposes setting up a National Bureau of Standards in criminology, which we think of National Institute of Forensic Science, that was proposed 73 years later, to conduct scientifically controlled experiments, to evaluate present practices, and emphasizes we need to make better use of scientific methods. The law enforcement agencies must be certain of their limitations as well as their merits. I still think that those things apply. Finally, I'll just finish with this, that we have a call for more science and forensic science, Tom Albright being one of the authors of this, that came out in PNAS last year. And 3 statements from it. DNA evidence and its success has changed our views and expectations of forensic science. I certainly think that's the case. That forensic techniques should be subjected to independent validation before being introduced into common use, was the conclusion that they drew. And finally, that research and academic scientists should become educated about forensic science and take active steps to welcome the discipline into the larger scientific community. And I love the fact we led off with Tom Albright talking about how basic science things can benefit and strengthen forensic science if we'll listen and learn from it. And I hope that we will communicate and collaborate as we go forward. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to address questions now, or we're probably out of time.
So fascinating. I really wanted you to watch this just because you've heard of the NAS report. Maybe this is the first time you've heard about it, but I'm assuming that it's gotten discussed before in some of your other classes. But the NAS report was this big deal. And it's nice to see on that timeline all the things that have been, all the things that the forensic science as a field has tried to do to address some of the things that were brought up in the NAS report. And so that timeline I thought was really cool and really nice to see that presentation. So I really wanted you to see that. The thing that struck me the most from his presentation is the sort of dive back in history and see that 80 years ago people were asking for the same things that the NAS report is asking in 2009, right? Those last few slides of his just really brought it all home for me. I mean, and I've noticed that. I mean, the forensic sciences, it's like a slow moving wheel. People are resistant to change. And I think that the reason people are resistant to change is just because, when you get your established testing set up and you're doing your routine testing the way you've always done it. I mean, I've come into that, like when I was working at the medical examiner's office in Phoenix, I would ask like, why are we doing this test like this? And you get an answer like, well, that's just how we've always done it. So it's like, oh, okay, cool. So we'll just keep doing it like this, even though it doesn't make any sense, think, what, well, I wonder why we're doing it like that, like that comes up in labs all the time. It's really funny. And it's like, well, we've been doing it for like 50 years like that, like that's why we do it. And so you see that, sometimes it takes a long time for the forensic sciences to sort of like chug around, like, and go through this cogwheel of innovation and, making change that, is positive, positive change for the field. So hilarious, right? To see that people were 80 years ago basically saying the same thing that this this report, NAS report, has asked of us. So the sad thing is, I don't know what it is, just not the hot button issue that you would hope it would be, even knowing how important forensic science is to cases in the criminal justice system, just get no love from the federal level, right? It probably would be a good idea to create this National Institute of Forensic Sciences, but definitely didn't hear the last administration talk about it. Haven't really heard the Biden administration talk about it, so it's unlikely to occur at this point. And an interesting thing is some of these committees that were created have all sort of been have ended just because they were only slotted for so many years of funding, and they weren't renewed. Some of the things that are still going are like the OSAC committees, and so that might be one that you've heard before, like the OSAC, committee on DNA or toxicology. Those are still active, while some of the other committees that have been created on the timeline, like you saw, have ended. But the wheels keep on turning, and we're hoping to overall improving. The goal is to improve forensic science, and seeing the white papers, seeing the when someone says white paper, they're talking about a publication in a journal, right? So when you print it out, it's like a little white paper packet there. So the white papers coming out, addressing the issues is all a positive thing, right? So, all right, that's all I had for you guys today. Hope that was interesting and you enjoyed that. I'll link up the PCAST and the NAS report, just kind of check them out. I might have a quiz or something pop up. I don't know. We'll see. Some assignment based on that. Like I mentioned before, I'll post a chapter from our author that we'll meet in our live Zoom session next week. And so hopefully that should be fun. Just kind of like talking to him about the case. Let's ask questions. Anything you think is interesting, especially based on the new reading. And that'll be great. And that'll be all we'll have next week. But I really hope you can all make it for that. Until then, I'll talk to you later. Thanks so much.